There's something quietly profound about the moment we decide to let go. Not just any letting go, but the kind that feels like a gentle release, a sigh of relief deep within the soul. It's the moment when we stop gripping so tightly, stop resisting the inevitable currents of life, and allow ourselves to move forward with grace. But why is letting go so difficult? Why do we cling to people, ideas, past mistakes, even pain, long after they've outlived their purpose? The truth is, letting go touches the core of what it means to be human. It asks us to confront our attachments, to face the uncomfortable reality that change is the only constant, and to step into the unknown without the safety net of certainty. In Buddhist teachings, this process of release is not simply an act of abandonment or weakness. It is, instead, a courageous and mindful surrender, a way to free ourselves from the chains of suffering caused by craving and attachment. To understand this deeply is to begin a journey that reshapes how we relate to ourselves and the world around us. Imagine carrying a heavy backpack filled with stones, each stone representing a fear, a regret, or a desire. At first, you might not even notice the weight because it's familiar. But over time, that burden slows you down, makes every step painful. Letting go is choosing to set down that backpack, piece by piece, at just the right moment. Not too soon, so you don't lose what's truly valuable. Not too late, so you aren't crushed under the weight. This delicate balance, knowing when and how to let go, is what this journey is all about. It's not just a philosophical idea, but a practical art. One that can transform our inner lives and the way we experience everything from grief and loss to ambition and love. As you listen and reflect on what follows, consider the places in your own life where holding on may no longer serve you. Where might the art of letting go open a door to peace, clarity, and freedom you didn't realize was there? The path ahead will explore ancient wisdom and timeless practices that guide us toward this freedom. We'll dive into how letting go is deeply woven into Buddhist philosophy, uncover the subtle signals that tell us when it's time to release, and learn how to cultivate this skill with intention and compassion. So take a breath. This is the beginning of a journey, one that invites you to look within, to untangle what binds you, and to discover the profound liberation waiting on the other side of surrender. There's a wisdom in Buddhism that stretches back over 2.5 millennia, a timeless understanding of what it means to hold on, and more importantly, what it means to let go. At its heart, letting go is not about giving up or abandoning what matters. It's about releasing the grip on the illusions and attachments that trap us in cycles of suffering. Buddhism teaches that much of our suffering comes from 3 powerful forces: craving, aversion, and ignorance. These are known as the 3 poisons. Craving pulls us toward things we think will bring happiness, possessions, relationships, status, while aversion pushes us away from what we fear or dislike. Ignorance blinds us to the true nature of reality, causing us to cling to a false sense of self and permanence. When we hold tightly to desires or fears, we are like a child clutching a fragile toy, terrified of losing it. Yet the more we cling, the more pain we invite. The Buddha described this as attachment, and understanding this is the first step toward true freedom. Central to this freedom is the concept of impermanence, or anicca. Everything we know, our feelings, our relationships, even our bodies, is in a constant state of flux. Nothing lasts forever. Recognizing this truth helps us see that clinging to anything as if it were permanent is a path to inevitable suffering. Then there's anatta, the idea of no fixed self. What we call I or me is really a collection of changing experiences, sensations, and thoughts. There's no solid self to hold on to in the first place. This insight gently dissolves the boundaries we create, freeing us from the need to protect an illusion. But here's the remarkable thing. Letting go is not about becoming cold or detached from life. It's about opening the heart wider. When we stop clutching tightly, we create space for compassion, joy, and wisdom to arise naturally. The art of letting go in Buddhist practice is a continuous unfolding, a dance between awareness and release. It asks us to look honestly at what binds us, to recognize the patterns of craving and fear, and to choose freedom instead. This is not easy. The mind resists losing what it believes it needs. But through mindfulness and meditation, we train ourselves to observe these attachments without judgment, to meet them with curiosity instead of fear. In that space of mindful awareness, letting go becomes less of a struggle and more of a natural response, like leaves falling from a tree in autumn, inevitable and beautiful. So, as we move forward, remember, this journey isn't about forcing yourself to let go. It's about waking up to what's true and learning to flow with life's changing currents. The next step will explore the subtle, often overlooked wisdom behind when to let go, because timing, as it turns out, is everything. Letting go, it's an art, a delicate dance that asks not only what we release, but when. Because timing can transform letting go from a painful loss into a liberating breakthrough. Think about the seasons. Trees don't drop their leaves all at once, nor do they cling until the last leaf is brown and withered. There's a natural rhythm, a perfect moment when the old must fall away to make room for new growth. So too with the things we carry in our hearts and minds. But how do we know the right time to let go? How do we recognize the moment when holding on becomes more harmful than helpful? Sometimes the signs are subtle, a growing sense of restlessness, a quiet but persistent ache inside. Other times, life forces our hand. A sudden change, a loss, a shift that leaves no room for denial. Yet the hardest part isn't just seeing the signs, it's trusting ourselves enough to act on them. We often hesitate, caught between fear and hope, unsure if we're giving up too soon or clinging for too long. In Buddhist teachings, this balance is called pakevkhana, the practice of careful self-reflection. It means observing the quality of our attachment with honest eyes, asking, is this still nourishing my soul, or is it draining my spirit? When we hold on too long, we risk becoming prisoners of the past, stuck in patterns that limit growth and joy. But letting go too early can mean abandoning potential or closing ourselves off before fully understanding. There's also the fear of emptiness, the void left behind after release. Yet, it is precisely in that emptiness that space opens for healing, insight, and renewal. Stories from Buddhist masters remind us that true wisdom isn't about rigid rules, but about deep listening to our hearts, our circumstances, and the subtle guidance of the present moment. One famous story tells of a monk who waited patiently for the right moment to leave his village, neither too soon to cause harm nor too late to miss his purpose. His discernment was a beacon of how timing and letting go can shape not just our inner peace, but the impact we have on the world. In our own lives, cultivating this wisdom takes practice. It requires patience, courage, and a gentle trust in the flow of life. The next step in our journey will explore how we can cultivate this art, the daily practices, meditations, and mindful habits that help us tune into the right timing for release. Because letting go isn't just a one-time event, it's a skill to nurture, a lifelong companion on the path to freedom. Letting go isn't something that just happens overnight. It's a skill, a practice, a way of being that we learn to nurture with intention and patience. The art of letting go is like tending a delicate garden. It requires daily care, mindful attention, and a willingness to face whatever arises. One of the most powerful practices is mindfulness. Simply put, mindfulness is the art of paying full attention to our thoughts, emotions, and sensations, without judgment or resistance. When we bring this gentle awareness to what we're holding on to, we begin to see its true shape and texture. We notice the stories we tell ourselves, the fears that keep us stuck, and the hopes that may no longer serve us. In Buddhist meditation, this practice is often called vipassana, or insight meditation. Sitting quietly, observing the flow of experience, we start to recognize that nothing is fixed. Thoughts come and go, feelings rise and fall, and the grip of attachment begins to loosen. Another essential practice is cultivating compassion, both for ourselves and for what we're letting go. Letting go can stir up grief, guilt, or self-doubt. Instead of fighting these feelings, we learn to embrace them with kindness, acknowledging that suffering is part of the human journey. Journaling can be a helpful tool here. Writing down what we're struggling to release, exploring the reasons behind our attachment, and expressing our fears or hopes can bring clarity and relief. Sometimes, putting it on paper is the first step to setting it free. We also find strength in community and teaching. In Buddhist tradition, the Sangha, the community of practitioners, supports each other through the challenges of letting go. Sharing our experiences, listening deeply, and receiving guidance can illuminate the path when it feels dark or confusing. Physical practices like mindful breathing and gentle movement also help. The breath anchors us to the present moment, reminding us that life is here and now. Yoga or walking meditation can ground our restless minds, creating space for release. Lastly, practicing gratitude shifts our focus from what we're losing to what remains and what's possible. Recognizing the preciousness of each moment encourages us to cherish what is, without clinging desperately to what was or what might be. These practices, woven together, create a powerful foundation for letting go with grace. They transform it from a painful loss into a conscious, loving act, one that opens the heart and lightens the soul. As we deepen these habits, we become more attuned to the natural flow of life, ready to release what no longer serves and embrace the freedom that comes with surrender. Next, we'll explore the obstacles that often arise on this path, the fears, doubts, and resistances, and how we can meet them with courage and wisdom. Throughout the ages, Buddhist masters have used stories and parables to teach the subtle art of letting go, not with heavy doctrine, but with vivid, living wisdom that speaks straight to the heart. One of the most famous tales is that of the old monk and the river. This monk, deeply serene, would sit by a river every day, watching the water flow. One day, a young disciple asked, "Master, why do you spend so much time by the river?" The monk smiled and replied, "The river teaches me. It never holds onto the water that passes by. It doesn't fight the current or try to stop the flow. It simply lets go and moves forward. So must we." This story holds a powerful truth. Resistance to change causes suffering, but acceptance and release bring peace. The river flows effortlessly, not because it has no obstacles, but because it knows when to hold and when to let go. Another parable comes from the life of the Buddha himself. Before his awakening, Siddhartha Gautama struggled deeply with attachment to his royal life, to his family, to worldly pleasures. Yet it was his courageous decision to let go of all that he knew and loved that led him to enlightenment. This was no impulsive act. It was a deeply conscious release, a step taken only after profound reflection on the nature of suffering and the impermanence of all things. Then there's the story of the burning house from the Lotus Sutra. Imagine a child playing inside a burning house, unaware of the danger. The father calls out, offering wonderful toys outside to lure the child to safety. The child hesitates, clinging to their playthings, unaware of the fire. This parable illustrates how attachment blinds us to danger and suffering. But through skillful means, compassion, wisdom, and timely intervention, release is possible, and liberation awaits. Even in daily life, we find lessons in simple moments. A tea master once said, "When you pour the tea, do not cling to the cup, let it flow freely." These teachings remind us that letting go is not about loss, it's about transformation. It's a path from bondage to freedom, from fear to trust. The masters also warn us of a common trap, mistaking letting go for indifference. True release is vibrant and alive, full of presence and care. It's not cold detachment but warm openness. In our own journey, these stories offer more than inspiration. They are guides that invite us to walk the path with courage and heart. As we embrace their lessons, we prepare ourselves for the inevitable challenges that come with letting go. And in the next chapter, we will face these challenges head-on, learning how to overcome the fears and doubts that arise when we try to release what binds us. In today's fast-paced world, the ancient art of letting go may seem like a distant ideal, something poetic but impractical. Yet, it is precisely now, amid the noise, stress, and endless distractions, that this wisdom is more essential than ever. Modern life bombards us with constant demands, deadlines, social media, relationships, and the pressure to succeed. We cling to our plans, identities, and comforts with fierce determination, often mistaking attachment for security. But Buddhism invites us to pause and ask, what if true security isn't in holding on tightly, but in releasing with trust? What if letting go is the key to navigating the chaos with clarity and calm? Imagine losing a job, ending a relationship, or facing illness. These moments can feel like the world collapsing. Yet they also open a door to transformation if we have the courage to walk through it. Practicing letting go today means learning to observe our reactions rather than be swept away by them. It means acknowledging the discomfort, the fear, and the resistance, but not letting those feelings control us. Mindfulness apps, meditation groups, and modern retreats offer practical tools that bring Buddhist insights into our daily routines. Even a few minutes of deep breathing or conscious awareness can create a pause, a gap where choice replaces automatic reaction. Technology, paradoxically, can help us here. Notifications can be reminders to check in with ourselves. Online teachings make ancient wisdom accessible at our fingertips. Yet, the greatest challenge remains personal. To let go of our need for control in a world that feels unpredictable. To accept uncertainty as part of the human experience. To trust that beneath the surface of loss and change, there is a deeper current of life flowing steadily. In relationships, letting go can mean releasing expectations, grudges, or the illusion that we can shape others to our desires. It opens space for genuine connection based on acceptance and love. At work, it might mean releasing perfectionism or fear of failure, allowing creativity and presence to flourish. Even in self-identity, the Buddha's teaching on anatta, no fixed self, invites us to let go of rigid labels and stories we tell about who we are, freeing us to evolve and grow. Applying the art of letting go today is not about withdrawal or passivity. It's an active engagement with life, rooted in wisdom and compassion. As we prepare to close this journey, the final chapter will gently bring us home, reflecting on the full circle of letting go, how beginnings and endings intertwine, and how surrender opens the door to true freedom. The journey of letting go brings us, ultimately, to a profound freedom. A freedom that is not about escaping life, but about fully embracing it with an open heart and a clear mind. Letting go is the gentle art of releasing what no longer serves us, our fears, attachments, expectations, and even our identities. It is a courageous act of surrender, not out of defeat, but out of deep wisdom and trust. When we let go, we step out of the prison of clinging and open ourselves to the vastness of the present moment. We discover that true freedom is not found in possession or control, but in the spaciousness of acceptance. This freedom transforms how we relate to ourselves and the world. It softens our judgments, opens us to compassion, and invites us to live with greater peace and authenticity. In the dance of life, holding on too tightly can cause pain and suffering. But when we learn to release with grace, we begin to flow like the river, like the breath, naturally and effortlessly. This does not mean life becomes perfect or free of challenges. Rather, it means we meet those challenges with a steady heart and an unshakable calm. The Buddha's teachings remind us that impermanence is the nature of all things. Embracing this truth allows us to let go without losing ourselves, to love without clinging, and to live fully without fear. As you move forward on your own path, remember that letting go is not a destination but a continuous practice. It is a lifelong companion that guides us through the seasons of joy and sorrow alike. So, take a deep breath, feel the ground beneath your feet, and step forward with courage. The art of letting go is also the art of coming home, home to yourself, to this moment, and to the endless freedom within. Thank you for journeying together through this exploration. May your path be filled with light, peace, and the beautiful freedom that comes from truly letting go.